And we'll move quickly to the next slide. So we'll start by looking at some statistics. Here we see the number of complaints to the DPC since 2018. The orange line represents GDPR complaints. The blue line is the total of all complaints, including those made under previous data protection legislation. And most interesting, I think, is the grey line, which represents what has consistently been the most frequent theme of complaints, and that's data access requests. Moving on, we're now looking at data breach notifications over the time, the number growing sharply through 2018, plateauing in 2019 and remaining relatively constant since then. Noteworthy here, I think, is the non-breach decisions since 2020, the decline in those, possibly due to the change to the breach notification process last year, which now includes screening questions to help data controllers to determine whether or not a breach notification is required. The yellow line here represents the number of breaches that arose from unauthorized disclosures, consistently coming in top of the list, topping out in 2020 at 86% of breaches notified. I think worth noting here, but you can see as well as unauthorized disclosures, consistently coming in top of the list in the top 5 are papers lost or stolen, phishing, hacking, and processing errors. So a lot of human errors there rather than technical ones. Beg your pardon. Let's go back. Here we see the complaints made under the ePrivacy directive. I've included this mostly as a reminder that the GDPR, while the principal piece of legislation around data protection, it's not the only one we're subject to. So as well as handling complaints and breaches, the data protection authorities continually publish notes, guidance, commentaries, and clarifications on aspects of legislation and its practical application. If you don't already, it's worth keeping an eye on your home regulator's website, as well as that of the European Data Protection Board. I've selected a few items here that I thought might be of particular interest to our audience today. I'm conscious it's a very diverse audience, and so I hope you'll take something from this. The first one here is the Data Protection Board's guidelines on the interplay between the Payment Services Directive 2 and the GDPR. Adopted in July 2020, these guidelines are more detailed and considered response, which was in response to a request to support an initial letter concerning regulatory interplay between the GDPR and the PSD2. They provide clarification on issues related to the collection and processing of personal data by organisations involved in the payment services sector. It provides clarity to data controllers that have legal obligations under PSD2. The EDPB confirms in the guidance that controllers in the payment services sector should always ensure compliance with the requirements of the GDPR, and they stress it. They do, however, appreciate the regulatory uncertainty that arises due to the complexity of the interplay between the two pieces of legislation, and the guidelines focus on a number of critical components, namely lawful grounds and further processing, explicit consent, the processing of silent party data, the processing of special categories of data under PSD2, data minimization, security, transparency, accountability, and profiling. The second piece here is the Data Protection Commission's initiative relating to the processing of children's data. In preparing their document, the Data Protection Commission engaged with expert stakeholders both in Ireland and globally. And while they were completing the document, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, produced an age-appropriate design code for online services processing children's data. The focus of the ICO code is on the necessary privacy by design features that must be engineered into the services used by children from the outset, whereas the DPC's focus is broader. It's not focused only on the engineering and design of the products and services, but also on how the data is treated. Having said that, the documents, they're consistent, and they're both underpinned by the principle of the best interests of the child. Fundamental human rights and freedoms, as we know, are at the core of GDPR. So a topic I'm sure will resonate with all of us on a personal level is the use of facial recognition in the area of law enforcement. The EDPB has just issued a guidance on the on the matter for public consultation, and the closing date for that is the 27th of June. And again, I've linked to the page on the website, and you might also have seen the open letter in the Irish Times last week responding to the Minister for Justice in Ireland's plans to expand the surveillance powers of the Gardaí with facial recognition technology. But if not, I've included the link in the bottom of the page, and this debate is one I'll be following very closely. In addition to resources issued by the data protection authorities, case law continues to inform the scope and application of data protection law. Here on this next slide, I've noticed 3 out of lots, thousands, but I picked out these ones because I think they're interesting cases that highlight how case law can influence the how case law can influence how we interpret the regulation. So the first here is Doolin versus the Data Protection Commission. This case revolves around the use of CCTV footage by Doolin's employer in informing a disciplinary action against him. The footage was gathered for the purposes of health and safety and security, and Doolin complained to the Data Protection Commission on the grounds that the disciplinary action was not a legitimate purpose. And what happened was the supervisory authority held for his employer. He then appealed it to the Circuit Court, who upheld the DPC's decision, and then he appealed it to the High Court. The High Court concluded that the Data Protection Commission had made an error of law in holding that no further processing took place, but the Data Protection Commission then appealed that to the Court of Appeal in Ireland, which found in Doolin's favour and upheld the High Court decision. So what I think this case illustrates is the breadth of resources available to individuals in the protection of their data, but that sometimes even the supervisory authority gets it wrong. The next one is the infamous DPC versus Facebook Ireland, or Schrems II as it's better known. This was the landmark case which began following the invalidation of the original EU-US data transfer mechanism, which was called Safe Harbour, in which Schrems was also a key player. In this latest case, though, Schrems' complaint to the Irish Data Protection Commission was that in the absence of a valid transfer mechanism, Facebook continued to transfer his data, relying on standard contractual clauses. In 2018, the High Court referred the case to the Court of Justice in the EU, along with 11 questions to be addressed. The ruling, delivered on the 16th of July 2020, upheld the validity of the standard contractual clauses, but declared that Privacy Shield was invalid. And as we know, this decision has had far-reaching implications for organisations and serves as a reminder of the power that other countries have over data when we move it to and through them. And we'll come back to this issue in a little more depth later on. And finally, a case that started out in a regional court in Germany, but which was escalated to the CJEU for clarification. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the names of the parties. Jerry might help me out later on with this one. So I'll refer to it by its common name, which is the Planet 49 case. So this case examined the mechanisms for consent on Planet 49's website, in particular cookies and the transfer of data to commercial third parties. So the most noteworthy rulings in this case are that consent is not valid if the storage of the information or access to information already stored in the website user's terminal equipment is permitted by way of a pre-checked tick box, which the user must deselect to refuse his consent. And also that the information that must be given to a website user includes the duration of the cookies and whether or not third parties have access to those cookies. You'll see there at the bottom, I've just have a link to bailey.org where you can examine all the cases and the CJEU's case law fact sheet on data protection. So here, in these graphs, we're looking at cumulative fines across the European Union over 2018 to 2022. In the first graph, it's clear that in 2021, particularly in the second half of the year, there was a record jump in fines. And it can be easy to get distracted by record fines and landmark cases, but I think what we should pay attention to here is the constant increase in the total number of cases taken by the data protection authorities. And while there are variations in the application and enforcement of the law across the EU, we can see that GDPR fines continue to rise in volume and in monetary value. And up to March of this year, the total number of fines was 1,031. That was already 505 more than the total sum for the last reporting period. And the sum total of these fines exceeds 1.5 billion euros. And that was largely contributed to by the huge fines imposed on the tech giants, which we'll quickly take a look at now. So these are the top 5 fines ever issued by the European data protection authorities. And the top one there is Amazon's gigantic fine announced in their July 2021 earnings report. And it was nearly 15 times bigger than what was the record fine at the time. And although the full reasons behind the fine are not confirmed, we do know that it has to do with cookie consent. And it wasn't the first time Amazon was punished this way in relation to cookies, because in late 2020, they were also fined by the French Data Protection Authority 35 million after allegedly failing to get cookie consent on its website. It's a lot of money, but I suppose in the scale of Amazon, it's not a huge amount. But to look at it, you know, it's a scary figure. So here, and I'm not going to go into the detail here, but it shows the top 12 fines. If you want to have a look at the fines, the reasons for them and the court rulings that led to them, German law firm CMS maintains an excellent database with the caveat that they can only publish information available in the public arena. The details of the vast majority of GDPR cases are not publicly available. But if we look just here on the right-hand side of this, at the most common triggers, we have insufficient legal basis for data processing, insufficient technical and organizational measures, and non-compliance with the general data protection processing principles. And indeed, these 3 things account for 11 of the top 12 fines. So it makes sense that as part of our data governance efforts, we keep these issues on our risk management radar. So quick look here now at adequacy decisions. Most of them predate the GDPR. The oldest is that with Switzerland, which dates back to 2000, and the latest is with the Republic of Korea, which was only decided in December last year. Brexit has had implications for the rules on transfers of personal data between the UK and the EEA. The UK government is in negotiations with all of these territories at the moment to make specific arrangements for transfers to the UK where that is possible. In relation to the decisions, with the exception of the United Kingdom, these decisions don't cover data exchanges in the law enforcement sector. They're governed by the Law Enforcement Directive, and the adequacy decisions apply across the EEA. So that's the EU 27 plus Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. So now, moving away from the overview, we're now going to look at some key events, the first being the one we're closest to geographically and otherwise, and that's Brexit. I suppose we couldn't get away with today without mentioning it. Brexit is almost as old as GDPR is. The referendum was held on the 23rd of June 2016, 7 weeks after GDPR came into force. Article 50 was triggered in 2017 and so began the countdown to the UK's formal exit from the EU. As of midnight on the 31st of December 2020, the transition period ended and the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement began. So in relation to data protection law, the UK adopted the EU GDPR, and that's now known there as the UK GDPR. There was a short period of uncertainty around data flows between the 2 jurisdictions. The EU did grant a grace period up to the 30th of June 2021, but on the 28th of June 2021, the EU approved 2 adequacy decisions for data transfers, the one under the GDPR and the other under the Law Enforcement Directive. These decisions are valid for 4 years up to the 27th of June 2025. And worth noting here is it's the first time that the EU has included a sunset clause in an adequacy decision. So at the moment, with minimal divergence between the EU GDPR and the UK GDPR, we have adequacy. But the EU will renew this agreement only if the UK continues to ensure an adequate level of data protection. The UK government is seeking to diverge from elements of the EU GDPR, replacing it with a more light touch framework. So there is a chance that we could see the adequacy decision removed before that sunset clause kicks in. So as well as that horizon risk of the EU-UK divergence, we also have the immediate risk of a failure in compliance with the EU GDPR and possibly also the UK GDPR. So under certain conditions, UK organisations may also be subject to EU GDPR. Article 3.1 states that if a UK organisation has, or an organisation has a presence in the EU, they fall under the scope of the GDPR. And if an EU organisation has a legal presence in the UK, they fall into the scope of the UK GDPR under Article 3.1. That's pretty straightforward. There's no surprises there. But now let's have a look at Article 3.2. And another risk to consider, the failure to understand the territorial scope of the regulation. So according to Article 3.2, in both the EU and UK GDPRs, an organisation doesn't have to have a legal presence in the territory to fall under the scope of it. They only need to be either offering goods or services, including free ones, to individuals who are in the territory or monitoring the behaviour of those individuals. This obligation also applies to international organisations outside the two territories. So a great resource for this is the EDPB's guidelines on territorial scope of the GDPR. It remains useful for UK organisations too, as long as these two regulations remain aligned. And of course, there's also the ICO guidance that I shared on the slide below too. So thick and fast now, here's yet another risk to consider, the failure to designate an Article 27 representative. You might be familiar with Article 27. It's often referred to as the forgotten article. It's a requirement for data controllers to appoint a representative in the territory. Again, this obligation applies under both the EU and the UK GDPR, and so applies to those who fall into the scope under Article 3.2. So what is this? In a nutshell, if you find yourself subject to either GDPR under Article 3.2, then you must appoint a representative in writing in that territory. The representative will be who the data subjects can go to if they have a complaint or need information about how their data is processed by the organisation. The table here will give you a clearer idea of the requirement. The EDPB's guidance on the territorial scope will explain it in greater detail. There are exceptions to this requirement. So if the processing is occasional, if the processing doesn't include large-scale processing of special category data or data relating to criminal convictions and offences, and if the processing is unlikely to result in a risk to the individual's rights and freedoms. Okay, not a high risk, just any risk to the individual's rights and freedoms. Or alternatively, if you're a public authority or body, you're also exempt. So staying with cross-border transfers, we'll now look at how the arrangements between the EU and the US have evolved over time. So Safe Harbour Agreement, that was a set of principles which governed the exchange of data between the US and the EU and Switzerland. It was ruled invalid by the ECJ in Maximilian Schrems versus the Data Protection Commissioner on the 6th of October 2015. And that ruling led to the creation of the EU-US Privacy Shield. Privacy Shield was introduced on the 12th of July 2016, but in the summer of 2020, the Court of Justice highlighted a fundamental issue with EU-US data transfers due to an inability to ring-fence the data from government agencies in the US. And as we saw earlier, the CJEU upheld the validity of the standard contractual clauses as a transfer mechanism, but declared that Privacy Shield was invalid. So in March of this year, the EU and the US have agreed in principle to a new transatlantic data privacy framework. However, this has already been subject to much criticism, and the likelihood is that it will be challenged again, and by Schrems, and he's already expressed that. But in the meantime, in the absence of a formal agreement, organizations who transfer data to or through the US must rely on other safeguards, and the most common of those being standard contractual clauses. And just quickly, just a little bit about those. So they're standardized and pre-approved model data protection clauses that allow controllers and processors to comply with their obligations under EU data protection law. They can be incorporated into contractual arrangements with your third parties on a voluntary basis to demonstrate compliance with data protection requirements. Reliance on standard, I'm going to say STCs, that's currently in a transition phase because the EU Commission has published its implementing decision on standard contractual clauses. And they did that on the 4th of June last year, in which it adopted 2 new sets of standard contractual clauses, one for use between controllers and processors within the EEA, and another for the transfer of personal data to countries outside of the EEA. So this issue presents yet another risk to your compliance, along with third-party risks. So when you're assessing your third-party risks, do you know who your third parties are? Do you have SECs in place with those third parties? If not, should you have them in place? If so, are they the new versions? And if not, they need to be updated before the transition period ends, and that's the 27th of December this year. So you can take a moment now to reset, and I'll catch my breath, and I'll hand over to Jerry, who's going to look at what appropriate technical and organizational measures are and how you might decide which ones are appropriate for your risk context.
So, good morning, and thank you, Fiona, for that. It certainly means continued work for you guys who are responsible for data protection. Before the GDPR rules became law, I attended a number of conferences, and the most common question that I heard at the time was, what is appropriate information security or technical and organizational measures? And because the GDPR doesn't give you any detail on that. So I was thinking about this, and people who have listened to some of my webinars in the past will know I often use cars as a metaphor. So I thought, well, if Tom's was a vehicle and you wanted to get from A to B, you know, you could, if I have control here, Fiona, you might advance, okay. You might use a Ford Fiesta, but if you're transporting a lot of money, then maybe you need something a bit more appropriate, like a bulletproof van. And if you were transporting furniture, then maybe a 40-foot truck would be appropriate. I think you get the point that appropriate depends on your individual context. Fiona. Many years ago, when I first started reading about information security, the old 18,099 standard was on information security before 27,001, kind of predecessor, and it referred to CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And this has stayed with us. You will often see it, and even in the GDPR, they talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we tend to focus on the confidentiality, which, yes, is focused on the privacy element of it. But there's more to information security than just privacy. Integrity is about maintaining the accuracy of the data and not allowing it to be corrupted or misused. Availability, what good is having lots of medical information if it's not available when it's needed? And these three things, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, are what you have to ensure. The next thing I looked at was, and these headings are my headings now. We talk about nature, scale, and complexity. Because if you want to decide on what's appropriate in terms of measures, in terms of technical and organizational measures, I thought, could I graphically represent this? And if I take these 5 areas, and you might come up with 5 different ones, but if you are sharing information in many countries, that's what I mean by geography. So lots of countries within the EU, outside the EU in particular, consider that. If the outcomes for the individuals could be serious in terms of serious for the individual, score that one highly. If the volume of data you're dealing with is high, that will influence the technical measures. If the nature of the information, you know, if it's personal, deeply personal information like medical records, or if it's deep information maybe about an individual that would allow other criminals maybe to hijack their identity and use it to commit serious crime. And if lots of people have access to the information, Fiona, if you consider all of these parameters, just look at the size of that area. And if you're scoring high in all of those 5 areas, then the size of that in my graphic of the plot area is representing to some extent the level of measures you need to apply. This is my attempt at trying to give you a graphic and understanding that when you're trying to decide, and only you can decide what is appropriate. Now, if you do have a breach and the regulator comes in, they will tell you what they think is appropriate for your organization, but you should be the one in place to better decide that, Fiona. So I thought I would show you what I think, and this is my opinion, this is not from any regulator because they won't tell you, but what would I expect as minimum things you should do to guarantee the technical side, and certainly organizational measures. You got to have an information security policy, and I don't care what size organization you are, you should have something documented on your policy on information security, a data retention policy, and this will stem from your GDPR policies in any case. How long are you going to keep the data? Assign responsibilities. I think in any organization, if you have information that you're minding, then individuals should have designated roles and responsibilities. Adopt a least privilege access policy. Only give people access to the information that they need to do their job and nothing more. That's a stance we should all have. Are you backing up your data? Remember that availability. It's not just about keeping the bad guys out, but can you, if you do have an attack, a cyber attack, and you lose data, can you restore it? Can you restore it quickly? If you have an application, and it doesn't matter what business you're in, if you have an application where you're gathering information, personal information, is the application secure by design? Now, you will talk about privacy by design, but applications, and my concern is that there are a lot of software developers who haven't got the training in secure application design. This is something we take earnestly and follow the OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project. I think this is a minimum requirement as well. Things often break when you attempt to change them. So again, in organizations, I would say have robust change management procedures. Fiona. Yes, there's a lot on the minimum. You thought you were getting away with just 7 items. Here's another 7. I'll cover these 3. Encrypt where it's confidential, where it's sensitive, encrypt it. It just makes sense, doesn't it? I think you need to have an instant response plan. Remember, if you spend a lot of effort trying to keep the bad guys out, trying to keep the information confidential, whatever the failure is, whether it's a system down failure, just on the availability side, do you have a plan? And if you don't have a plan to handle the various incidents, and it doesn't have to be a 45-page plan, even a 5-page plan will be good, then you're missing a trick here in terms of appropriate measures. Have you tried doing a data restore? 53% of data restores fail. That's an incredible number, and it's been consistent for years. And it's because, believe it or not, the backup failed in the first place, and people didn't know the backup failed. You should test your own measures. test your measures. It's not good enough to say we have these plans if you've never tested them. Test your restore, test your incident response plan. And train your employees. Again, we find people have policies, people have procedures, but the staff are poorly trained in them. Fiona. And Fiona related to publications from various bodies, including one recently from the Irish Data Protection Commissioner on case studies. And there's two of those case studies that I just read yesterday because it was appropriate. We're talking about appropriate information security. And the two that I read, one was on medical information and the other was on banking details. And the common theme on these two cases was that the organizations had poor processes. I would say that people didn't have a checklist, didn't stop to think, am I processing this information incorrectly? Am I protecting this information the way I should? They weren't following, if they had the processes, they weren't following their own processes, and either they didn't know them or the policies hadn't translated down into correct procedures and processes. So these need to be lived organizational processes. Now, if that was the minimum, yes, there are lots of other things you should consider that might be appropriate. Information classification. You know, is it public information? Is it company confidential? Is it highly confidential? If you don't have a classification of information and you're treating everything the same, then you're possibly spending too much money protecting the information, or the really sensitive stuff isn't getting enough protection. If, and I suspect a lot of you have people working remotely, it is now recommended that you have multi-factor authentication. What that means is it's no longer good enough to have username and password. You need to have some other factor, whether it's a biometric or whether it's a code that people have to put in to identify themselves as the person. So it's not just something you know, but maybe something you have as well, or something you are. If you have highly critical data, then maybe you should consider failover systems or alternative systems, so that if your main system fails for whatever reason, it fails over to a backup system that's available within seconds. Again, it's that availability side of it. Those of you who have, who will know how the loss of a system might impact your ability to deliver a service, and you're not, if you were unable to deliver a service because the ESB is out, then you will have USPs, uninterruptible power supplies, generators, so that you can operate without electricity. Test the restore process. I did say test your measures in the last one. I think testing the restore probably should be under a minimum. Asset inventory. Do you know all the assets you have? And by assets, I mean those assets where you're storing the information. Do you know where information is stored? Have you a list of all of the assets? I'm talking about all laptops, mobile phones that may contain personal information, corporate servers. Have you got an inventory? And is there somebody responsible for each of those assets? Fiona. And finally, the last five, again, depending on the information you're holding, but do you conduct at least annual penetration testing to see, can the bad guys get in? A penetration test is somebody who has the same skills as a cyber attacker tries to hack into your system and tells you where the gaps are. We do this every year, and it's invaluable, if only for peace of mind. Employee screening. You know, if you're handling very sensitive information, you want to make sure that the people you employ are well screened and you have checked them out, because if it happens that you employ somebody whose goal was to gain access to confidential information, and there are many cases of this where they steal information and then disappear, you are still responsible. Data destruction. When you no longer have any need for that laptop or that server and you're getting rid of it, do you destroy the information? And I mean destroy. I don't mean just ship out the PC or the server. You need a policy and a disposal procedure. If you're passing it to somebody else, do you get certification that they have disposed it in a safe secure manner. And something that has been coming up more frequently in the last few years is we give access to people to systems and information. And then when they leave the organization, do we revoke that? Do we revoke it immediately? And it's becoming, I think, a bigger issue because there are many systems that organizations depend on to deliver a service. And if an individual has access to 10 or 15 systems and they leave the organization, can you quickly disable their access to that information? Fiona. I think it's back to you. Thank you for listening, folks.
Thanks, Jerry. Yep, so it's back to me just quickly to look at what's coming down the road. So keep watching, that's the code. The rules regulating cookies, they're still being set. There's no sign yet of the new ePrivacy regulation that will replace the current directive. And cookies themselves, they're continually evolving, which means that maintaining a current cookie policy will be a continuous job. However, if you properly inform your visitors to your website about cookies that your site's using, and when necessary, receive their consent, that will keep them happy and that will keep you compliant. The aim of the European data strategy is to make the EU a role model for a data-driven society, where data will flow freely across countries and sectors, while respecting privacy and data protection laws. And there are three elements to that. There's the Data Governance Act, a single market for data, and the Data Act. Then there's the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. It is, as the title suggests, a law on artificial intelligence, the first of its kind by a major regulator anywhere. It categorizes AI applications into 3 risk categories. So in the first are applications and systems that generate unacceptable risk. For instance, those that government-run social scoring, such as the ones used in China. And anything that falls into this category is banned. So in the second category, here we have high-risk applications such as a CV scanning tool, for instance, that ranks job applicants. So anything in this category is subject to specific legal requirements. And in the third category, that's for applications that are not explicitly banned or listed as high risk. And these will be, for the most part, unregulated. And of course, we need to be following closely the developments brought about by the UK reform process, and what that will mean for our data protection arrangements as a result. And not forgetting to maintain a wider international view of developments relating to data transfer mechanisms. And I've put links to each of those items on the bottom of the screen there. And now it's over to you for questions. So I see there are some here already. So the first, I think it might be for me, and it's from Paul Brawley, and he asks, are Northern Ireland residents covered under UK GDPR or the EEA? Will this depend on their citizenship? Well, no. So data protection law is not devolved. So they will be covered under the UK GDPR when their data is processed in the UK. But if we're in the EEA and we're processing their data, then they're covered under we're liable for them under the GDPR, the UK GDPR as well. So I hope that answers that question. It doesn't depend on citizenship, but it also it's worth saying that the Northern Assembly has reserved the matter, so it could change. They could legislate in the future, but for the time being, it's the UK GDPR that applies in Northern Ireland. Raji has asked, employee screening is mentioned as a measure to secure data. However, how best can we do this? Surely even with checks, anyone could disappear with data as references. As references now have to remain neutral. So that one's for Jerry.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I agree with you that references that you get in writing have to remain neutral, and I don't put huge stock in those. But I think there's lots of things you can check. You can check people's if they have particular qualifications, you can check whether that is kosher. You can indeed, if they have references, speak with people. I don't take written references myself as having huge value because, as you said, they tend to be very neutral. But if you speak to people who know the person you're about to hire, and if you are a HR person, then you will know very often it's what people don't say that communicates a lot of information. But people will tell you an awful lot more verbally because it's not written down and they can't get sued because it's a private conversation. So I would certainly follow those up with a verbal check, if you like. But check the stuff that you can, check any claims of experience. It is a difficult one, but not to do it is missing a key element. If later they do abscond with the information and you hadn't checked, and a cursory check would have established that they were a fraud from day one. It doesn't stop maybe people of good repute who've never done anything bad in the past still doing it, but it's something you should do. And indeed, if some jobs require even a vetting check. Okay. There's one there for you, Fiona. When do you think the EU Artificial Intelligence Act is due?
Okay, so it's in proposal stage at the moment. The document, I've linked to the document in the last slide. What I can say is that the short answer is I don't know, but the Commission has expressed that it wishes to expedite it. So it had been expected sometime this year, but I don't have any indication at the moment as to when that will be. But, you know, watch this space. I'm sure we'll be commenting on it as soon as we see it. Any updates to harmonization of enforcement or national regulatory functions? There are guidance and there's constant communication, and the one-stop shop system has helped to promote harmonization of enforcement. If you take the WhatsApp fine that was issued when the DPC issued that, they issued it at a much lower level, and the one-stop shop system allowed the other data protection authorities in the EEA to convince them to increase the fines. So yes, harmonization is happening, but there's still a lot of space between them at the moment. So is a data controller obliged to conduct transfer impact assessment for data being hosted in the cloud by Amazon Web Services, Azure, etc.? That depends, Jim. That depends on what you're transferring. Is it high risk? What's the outcome for the individual if their data is compromised, lost, stolen, or otherwise exposed due to the transfer? What a transfer impact assessment is really, it's a data protection impact assessment on the risks to the data subjects at the level of data transfer. So my answer to you is that do a preliminary examination of what it is you're transferring, and if it would result in a high risk to the individual, then yes, conduct a transfer impact assessment. Is the Data Protection Commission expected to focus on particular aspects of GDPR? They do it all the time. So they do thematic reviews, they do audits. They did a sweep of websites 2 years ago in which they examined cookies and other mechanisms on websites. So they're constantly focusing on particular aspects of the GDPR, and they're constantly publishing guidances on particular aspects. So keep an eye on the websites and you'll be able to access those. I think the next one is for you, Jerry. With technology that learns about endpoints, so PCs or laptops, behavior via machine learning, would that be of concern for GDPR? This would be technology that learns normal behavior and then in the future is used to block non-normal behavior in the interest of security. Okay, so if I just quickly answer and then Jerry, you might take it up. So my answer would be that what would happen there is automatic decision making. And of course, GDPR does have something to say about automatic decision making in that data subjects have a right to object to it and have a human being to make the decisions rather than the machines. But from a security point of view, Jerry?
I would say what this seems to be referring to is there are technology solutions out there that look at what is normal behavior on a network. It's because networks generate so many alerts these days that you'd need to have an army of IT people to investigate every single alert. So they if you like, the principle of these systems is that it's looking at the network and sees what normal behavior is, normal data transfers. But when it starts seeing unusual behavior, maybe an upload of files to a server in Hong Kong, you might say, we've never communicated with servers, in Hong Kong, that would create an alert. I don't see how this would affect the privacy of any individual. It's generally unanonymized, unless, of course, it's the finance department that is doing a transfer to a bank in America, and you happen to know that, well, we've just started doing business with somebody in America. But I don't think it's anything specific to the individual. It's the behavior on the network. So my feeling is that this will be fine. Personal opinion. It's nothing personal about the individual. It's behavior on the network, not behavior of the individual. I mean, the individual's laptop could be compromised because they clicked on a link, and now all of a sudden that laptop is a zombie and is under the control of somebody external to the organization and is doing bad stuff. You want to detect that, and it's nothing got to do with the individual who owns or operates the laptop. So I think that one is okay.
Okay. And
final question.
There's an anonymous question. For somebody looking to develop further with GDPR compliance, are there any tips on qualifications that may be useful? Well, I have to recommend the course with DCU through the IOB. The ACOI also recommend that one. Or Compliance Ireland. I don't think I'll ever get used to calling it the new name. So have a look at the ACOI website and what they recommend. And the Institute of Bankers, their website is very informative also. So those would be my recommendations, and purely because I've been through that process already. And I don't know of any others in Ireland at the moment anyway. So I hope that helps. There's one question in the chat, Jerry. We might just have time. I know we've gone 10 minutes over. So Roisin says their headquarters is in Northern Ireland and their data is stored on servers in Northern Ireland, but they have offices in the Republic. However, no doubt there will be data on laptops and mobiles in these offices. So the question is UK GDPR or GDPR? So for the data that's on the laptops and mobiles that belongs to EU residents, then it's EU GDPR. For the data that belongs to UK residents, it's the UK GDPR. So I hope that clarifies that for you. Okay, just a quick word there. Our website is our resources page. It's got lots of Jerry's article is there, his white paper. You can rewatch our webinars. You can email us at our email addresses are there. And the next webinar is next Wednesday, June the 15th at 10:30. And that's on the fundamentals of good governance for national governing bodies and LSPs. So we'd love if you could join us for that. Okay, so there's another question in the chat from Hugh, but he just asked in Northern Ireland, but I don't know what it means. So Hugh, if you'd like to clarify your question, and if not, then we will finish. And it just remains for me to thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.